The soft crunch of gravel under boots was the only sound as John Carter stepped through the iron gates of the cemetery. In one hand, he held a bouquet of lilies, her favorite. In the other, a folded letter, yellowed at the edges, written months ago, but never delivered. He stopped at her grave. Margaret and Carter, beloved wife. 1959 to 2023. The words carved into the stone stared back at him like a fresh wound. I thought moving here would be peaceful, he said softly, placing the flowers down. But I guess peace doesn't come that easy. The breeze stirred his shirt sleeve, a fitted navy half-sleeve tee with a faint imprint of a law enforcement badge just beneath. It was subtle, tucked near the hem, nearly invisible. John never wore it to show who he was. He wore it because it reminded him who he still had to be. He looked up at the sky and stood still for a while, eyes closed. When he opened them again, his expression had hardened. The walk back to his new house was quiet. The suburban street was clean. Too clean. Like it was trying too hard to be perfect. He noticed it the second he reached the front porch. A bold red paper, flapping lightly in a breeze, nailed right onto his doorframe. Final notice of violation, mandatory removal or eviction in 14 days, by order of the Housing Compliance Board. He stared at it for a long time. No name, no contact, no specific reason, just a thread. Inside, John sat in his old brown truck parked in the driveway. He didn't start the engine. He didn't move. The red notice was now crumpled in the passenger seat. His hand drifted to his chest, fingers touching the badge chain under his shirt, but he didn't take it out. He just breathed. Later that day, as he walked toward his mailbox, a woman from 2 houses down waved but quickly turned away. Another neighbor glanced from behind a curtain. A dog barked. And then silence again. That evening, he stood in his backyard, staring at the small memorial he'd built. A simple rose bush with a wooden carving that said, "Her garden." Nothing dramatic. Just something for her. He heard footsteps on the gravel path. Turning, he saw her, the woman in the gray blazer and heels. Clipboard. Tight lips. "Karen, you can't have that statue in your yard," she said, pointing with her pen toward the carving. He blinked. "Pardon?" It violates Article 6, Section 2.2. No unsanctioned religious or decorative structures visible from adjoining lots. John followed her gaze to the tiny rose bush and wooden sign. That's not a structure. That's a plant and a piece of wood. "Well," she said with a slight smirk, "now it's an official notice. Your property is non-compliant. And don't think special treatment's coming just because you're new here." He didn't answer. He just looked at her for a moment, not with anger, but something deeper. Wounded patience. That night, he sat alone in his dimly lit kitchen, flipping through the neighborhood welcome packet she'd given him on day one. Pages of rules, codes, and penalties. But nothing about eviction for a flower or a plaque. A cold cup of coffee sat untouched. There was no reason for this, unless they knew who he was. But why would that matter? He pulled out an old envelope from his moving box. Inside, a newspaper clipping from years ago. Commissioner Carter retires after 30 years of service. Legacy of justice, loss, and honor. He stared at the photo. A younger version of himself, smiling stiffly in uniform. He hadn't told anyone here who he used to be. And maybe that was the problem. Before the screen fades to black, a single voice cuts in calm but direct. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real stories, and drop a comment below if you've ever dealt with anything like this. Then silence again as the image lingers on the eviction notice pinned to his door, fluttering in the wind, like a challenge he's not yet ready to answer. The next morning came colder than usual, though the sun hung high and unbothered in the sky. John opened his front door not to peace, but to paper again. This time, a second notice, taped over the first. Bold ink, heavier language. Violation escalated. Fine pending. Legal action possible. Still no explanation. Still no signature. He carried the paper inside like it was something rotten, laid it flat on the kitchen table, and stared at it while sipping lukewarm coffee. His hand trembled once as he reached for his reading glasses, but he didn't put them on. He already knew what it said. Not because he had read it, because this kind of tactic was all too familiar. He'd seen it done to vulnerable homeowners for decades, but never from this side. He decided it was time to talk. By mid-morning, he was walking up to the HO office, a converted garage on the other side of the neighborhood with a dusty sign reading Community Board. No flag, no warmth, just rules and cold chairs. Inside sat Karen. She didn't look surprised to see him. "You're not allowed back here without an appointment," she said, tapping her pen on the desk. "Didn't you get the notice?" "I got a few," John replied, calm but firm. None of them explained the violation. Karen raised her eyebrows. "Your garden statue." He blinked. "You mean the carved piece of wood by the rose bush?" "The one for my wife. Call it what you want. It doesn't conform to uniform property standards. It must be removed or you'll be fined. There's a neighbor 3 houses down with a garden gnome in his yard," John said. "Been there since the day I moved in." Karen's face didn't change. "That statue was grandfathered in. Yours wasn't." He looked around the office. Empty chairs. A few folders. On a corkboard behind her was a calendar marked with red slashes and post-its. One said, "Carter action by Friday." He narrowed his eyes slightly. "This personal?" Karen stood. "This is procedure. I don't play favorites, and I don't tolerate resistance." He took a slow breath, nodded once, and left. As he stepped outside, a soft voice called from across the street. "Mr. Carter?" A young woman, mid-30s, holding a toddler's hand and a reusable shopping bag, walked toward him. "I live next door," she said. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." "For what?" "They're doing it again," she said quietly. "You're the 4th homeowner they've tried to push out this year. Always starts with little violations. Flower pots, flags, fences that were too tall. All older residents." John's jaw clenched. "Why?" She hesitated. "Some say it's because the HOA board is trying to flip certain properties for investors. One man had to sell his place at a loss. Karen's brother bought it a month later and relisted it twice the price." John nodded slowly. His voice dropped low. "Did anyone file a complaint?" "They tried. Nothing stuck. She controls the board. And most people here, they're afraid. Or just too tired to fight." He thanked her and walked home, his mind racing. That evening, as the sun dropped low and the neighborhood dimmed into silence, John checked his mailbox. Bills. Flyers. One unmarked envelope. Inside it, a USB drive. No note. No label. He plugged it into his laptop cautiously. The folder inside was simple. HOA meeting May 3.mp4. He clicked it. A grainy hidden camera recording played. Karen sat at the HOA table with 2 men, their faces familiar from neighborhood walks. "He used to be a cop, I think," one said. "That Carter guy." Karen rolled her eyes. "Retired or not, he's not staying here. He brings a certain image. And we have plans for that lot. Think he'll fight." Karen leaned back, smirking. "We'll bury him in paperwork before he can even figure out how we started." John froze the frame. His hand slowly moved to the drawer beside the laptop. Inside a badge case. Not for show. Not for power. For truth. He hadn't wanted to use it again. But justice didn't retire. Before the frame dimmed, a calm voice echoed once again. "Thank you for watching this far. If you've ever been mistreated by a neighborhood board, share your story in the comments, like this video, and subscribe for the next part of John's journey." The video ended on John's eyes, still, focused, and beginning to burn. The morning after watching the footage, John sat at his old wooden desk, one he hadn't used since retirement. Sunlight poured in through the blinds, but the warmth didn't reach his shoulders. The badge sat open in front of him now. Commissioner. The same badge he'd sworn never to flash again, unless absolutely necessary. He placed the USB drive next to it, then picked up his phone. "Hey, Terry. It's me." On the other end, a familiar voice, gruff but warm. "John? Haven't heard from you in over a year. You okay? I need a favor." Off the record, there was a pause. "It's serious then." "Yeah." John emailed over the video, and within hours, Terry, an old colleague still active in the department, called him back. "You're sitting on gold. That's conspiracy, targeted harassment, and possibly fraudulent property management. What do you want to do?" "I want to handle it my way. But I need background. Financials. Board structure. Any complaints ever filed and quietly buried. You sure you're ready to step into this again? I was never out. By noon, John had a small folder of documents, public records and complaint filings that never reached enforcement. Most were dismissed without investigation. Same handwriting, same signatures, same pattern. He spent hours building a timeline. Each eviction attempt, each sale, each resold property tied back to someone on the board or their relatives. The picture was forming. That evening, as he stepped outside to clear his head, he noticed a small gathering near the cul-de-sac. Karen stood with her usual clipboard, chatting and laughing with a few residents. It looked innocent, friendly, but John now saw the unease behind the eyes of those listening. As he walked past, Karen glanced at him. "You're awfully quiet lately," she said, voice sweet but edged. "Found a way to remove that little a violation?" John didn't stop. "Working on something bigger." She blinked. "Well, just remember, you move here, Mr. Carter. You play by our rules." He smiled softly. "I wrote the rules, ma'am. I just used to enforce them with a badge instead of a clipboard." Karen froze for a second, but John was already walking away. Back home, he printed photos of every property targeted in the last 2 years. On each, he wrote names, dates, and outcomes. The wall above his desk slowly turned into an investigation board. Tax, string, notes, headlines. But one space remained empty. His own photo. That's when the knock came. Not the usual HOA notice or door flyer. A real knock. Hard. He opened it. 2 uniformed officers stood there, firm expressions. "Sir, we've had a complaint of verbal harassment against you by a board member. We're here to ask you to come down to the station and give a statement." John blinked slowly. "Harassment?" One of the officers looked slightly uncomfortable. "Says you threatened her during a community meeting." "I've never attended a community meeting." "She claims you made a comment about enforcing rules your way." John chuckled under his breath. "Did she mention I'm a retired police commissioner?" Both officers looked at each other. One raised an eyebrow. "She left that part out," the younger one said. John stepped back and opened a drawer just inside the door. He retrieved a copy of the USB footage and handed it over. "This is a recording of a private HOA meeting. I think you'll find who's been harassing who." The older officer took it. "We'll take a look." As they turned to leave, John added, "If you need a formal deposition, I'd be happy to testify. I've kept everything, dates, documents, financial transfers." The younger officer gave a short nod. Noted. When the door closed, John leaned against it for a moment. This wasn't about violations anymore. This was war. But this time, he wasn't alone. Later that night, he posted on the neighborhood forum, a place most people avoided due to how controlled it had become. He typed slowly, carefully. "Dear neighbors, my name is John Carter. I am a retired police commissioner. I've recently discovered patterns of behavior from our HOA board that appear to violate legal and ethical standards. If you've experienced anything unusual, unexplained notices, fines, or pressure to sell, I encourage you to reach out to me privately. You are not alone, and we still have rights." He hit post and waited. At first, nothing. Then one message. Then 5. Then 20. One read, "She forced us to sell last year. Said we were out of compliance. I had no idea others were dealing with the same." Another, "They tried to fine me for hanging my grandson's flag. I never fought back. I was scared." By midnight, John had a folder of over 40 messages. Each one a story. Each one a voice waiting to be heard. And John had just begun to listen. By morning, John's inbox had nearly doubled. More stories. More fear. More people who had lived in silence for years. Most of them were older residents, just like him, retired, widowed, or simply too exhausted to challenge the powerful. But now someone had finally stood up. He spent the early hours organizing everything. Each message was printed and placed in a separate folder. He wasn't just building a case, he was preparing a record. Something that couldn't be erased or dismissed. This wasn't just about his statue or a petty fine anymore. It was about an entire pattern of abuse. Around noon, his phone rang. "John Carter." "Yes. This is Lisa Holt. I'm a civil rights attorney. One of your neighbors forwarded me your post on the forum. Said you're collecting evidence. I am. I'd like to help. Pro bono. John leaned back in his chair, surprised. You sure? I've been waiting for a case like this for years. These HOA boards think they're untouchable. But when they start targeting vulnerable people, older citizens, immigrants, widows, it crosses a line. We can expose this. He agreed to meet her that evening. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't sitting idle. Across the street, John noticed an unfamiliar car parked outside a neighbor's house. Two men in suits stood on the porch, speaking to an elderly woman. She looked confused, clutching a letter. John walked over calmly. Afternoon, he said. Everything okay here? The woman looked up. Mr. Carter, they're saying I have to leave, that my house is being reassessed for code violations. John turned to the men. On whose authority? One of them reached into his jacket and flashed a badge, City Housing Authority. John studied it. It was real. But why now? He asked. The man shifted. We received a tip from the HOA regarding unsafe property modifications. There haven't been any. That's not our call to make. John's voice dropped slightly. It is mine, actually. He reached into his own pocket and opened his badge case, revealing his commissioner credentials. The men paused, clearly not expecting this. I like the name of the person who filed that tip. The men exchanged glances. One finally said, Karen Willis. John turned back to the woman. You're not going anywhere. They're done using fear as a tool. That night, Lisa arrived. A sharp-eyed woman with a voice that didn't flinch. They sat across from each other, surrounded by folders, photos, and testimonies. She smiled gently. You've done your homework. This isn't the kind of neighborhood I thought I was retiring into. Lisa opened her laptop. We're going to need a media trail. Once this breaks, they'll try to bury it again. But if we have names, documents, videos, it becomes too loud to ignore. They began working side by side. Every name that had been evicted, every suspicious sale, every board member involved. One pattern became especially alarming. Properties were often sold just days after citations, many purchased through shell LLCs with connections to Karen's relatives. At 2 a.m., they took a break. The walls of John's office were now filled with color-coded strings and printed receipts. It looked like a detective's war room. You realize, Lisa said, sipping coffee, they're going to retaliate. They already are. As if on cue, the power flickered. The lights dimmed, then went out completely. John stood and checked the breaker. Everything was intact. A moment later, he heard it. Tires on gravel. A slow drive past the house. He pulled back the curtain. Karen's car. She didn't stop. Just drove past slowly, eyes forward. She knows, Lisa said behind him. She thinks this will scare me, John replied. What now? He turned from the window. We take it public. Everything. Before she gets the chance to silence someone else. That morning, John uploaded a video to a secure platform. Not just the meeting footage, but voice messages, neighbor testimonies, and a clear map of the entire scheme. He included names, titles, dates, and numbers. Then he sent it to local journalists. Within 12 hours, he got a call from a news producer. We'd like to interview you, Mr. Carter. This story, it could wake a lot of people up. John glanced at the wall of evidence behind him. Good, he said. It's time they saw what's happening. That night, the neighborhood forum exploded. Did you see the news? Karen's name is everywhere. Channel 4 is doing a special on HOAs next week. But not everyone was celebrating. At 10:17 p.m., John's doorbell rang. A package sat on his doorstep. No return address. Inside, a single photo of his late wife's statue, now smashed. No note. No explanation. But the message was clear. John held the pieces in his hand, heart sinking. He whispered quietly, You just made this personal. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. John stood over the broken pieces of the statue, his late wife's face now shattered in stone. He didn't move for a while. The world outside felt quiet, too quiet, like everything was waiting for his next decision. But inside, something had shifted. This was no longer about a fight with the HOA. This was about respect, dignity, and standing up to people who believed power made them untouchable. The next morning, Lisa returned with 2 large files. She placed them on John's table like evidence at trial. Karen's family has 3 LLCs tied to 17 properties in the region, most of them acquired through the same sudden evictions we've seen in your neighborhood. Some properties were even flipped within weeks at massive profit. John stared at the paperwork, jaw clenched. So this wasn't just bullying. It's a business. Lisa nodded. Predatory housing. Using HOA rules to drive people out, then buying cheap and reselling high. You were just the first to say no. John looked toward the statue's remains, still sitting in the corner, and said softly, "Then let's show them what happens when they cross the wrong person." They started with a town hall meeting. At first, residents were hesitant. Fear still hung in the air. Karen's influence had been built over years of silence. But John wasn't silent anymore. He stood before the small crowd at the community center, badge visible, documents in hand. "I'm not here to threaten anyone. I'm here because I believe we deserve to live in a place where fear isn't delivered with a fine. Where community means trust, not control." Someone clapped. Then another. Then the room erupted in applause. When he showed them the documents, the testimonies, the videos, there were gasps. One elderly man whispered, "She fined me for flowers, just to sell my place to her nephew." That meeting was recorded and uploaded. Within 24 hours, it had 200,000 views. Karen responded the only way she knew, how: legal threats. Her attorney issued cease and desist letters to John, Lisa, and even some of the neighbors who had spoken out. But it was too late. The story had already reached national news. A feature aired on a major network titled "Retired Police Commissioner Uncovers HOA Corruption Ring." John watched from his living room as his face appeared on screen, the story playing out like something from a movie. Only this was real. He received messages from across the country, people thanking him, sharing their own HOA nightmares, some even offering to testify. But not everyone was happy. The night after the broadcast, John's home was vandalized. Spray paint on the garage. Windows cracked. Another message, "Drop it." Lisa urged him to call in official protection. John agreed, just in time. Within 48 hours, the local police, some of whom he had trained years ago, were stationed outside his home. Quietly, discreetly. The next day, the real shift happened. A government investigator reached out. "We've been building a case for months," the man said over the phone. "Your evidence gave us the final puzzle piece. We're launching an audit into the HOA board, effective immediately." John didn't celebrate. He just nodded and said, "Let me know how I can help." Karen was served 2 days later. The moment was caught on video, her expression stunned as a uniformed officer, one of John's former cadets, handed her the papers. She tried to speak, but the officer simply said, "You'll have your day in court, ma'am." Word spread quickly. By the following week, a full federal investigation was underway. The entire board was suspended, and a temporary leadership group, comprised of elected residents, took over operations. John refused to be part of it. "I didn't do this to take control," he told the group. "I did it to give it back to the people." In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The threats stopped. The unfair fines disappeared. New residents were welcomed instead of watched. John finally rebuilt the statue of his wife, this time in the community garden, where children played and older residents gathered for coffee. He placed it there with a small plaque. "Justice doesn't retire." And one spring morning, as John watered the flowers near the base of the statue, a young boy passed by on his bike and waved. "Hey, Mr. Carter. My grandma says you're like a real superhero." John smiled, tipping his head. "Tell your grandma I just kept my promise." And as the breeze passed through the trees and laughter rang in the air again, John knew, for the first time in a long time, this felt like home. Before the screen fades, a gentle voice reminds the viewer, if you believe in standing up for what's right, no matter your age, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Someone out there needs this story. Because sometimes, the badge never really comes off. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood began to feel different, not just in appearance, but in spirit. The fear that once gripped the residents had melted into a quiet sense of community. People smiled again, greeted each other on the sidewalk, even stopped to chat at mailboxes. The scars were still there, but they were healing. John spent his mornings tending to the community garden, a spot that had once been neglected under the old HOA's rule. Now, it bloomed vibrant, peaceful. Every flower he planted felt like a quiet rebellion against what once was. Every child who laughed nearby was proof that it had been worth it. But one afternoon, Lisa showed up again, holding a letter in her hand. "You need to read this," she said, handing it to him. It was an invitation from the state's Housing Oversight Commission. They were hosting a public hearing on HOA abuse across the region, and they wanted John to testify. "I'm not a politician," he said, folding the letter. "You're a voice people trust," she replied. "They need to hear what happened." "What still happens?" John didn't answer right away. He glanced over at the statue of his wife in the garden. It had become a sort of monument, not to victory, but to endurance. And maybe that was reason enough. 2 weeks later, John walked into the state capitol building. The hearing room was packed. Reporters, legal teams, families, elderly residents, dozens of people just like him, waiting to be heard. When it was his turn to speak, he walked slowly to the microphone. Not with nerves, but with the quiet weight of someone who had lived it. "My name is John Carter. I served as a police officer for over 30 years. When I retired, I thought I was coming home to peace. Instead, I found myself back in a different kind of war, one not fought with violence, but with fear." He described the citations, the intimidation, the broken statue, the families forced to leave their homes. He spoke of Karen, of the corruption, and of the neighbors who had finally found the courage to speak. "I'm not here to tear down HOAs," he said. "I believe in order, in rules. But rules without compassion become weapons, and power without oversight turns neighbor against neighbor." By the time he finished, the room was silent. One commissioner stood and said, "Mr. Carter, you've not only shed light on a hidden issue, you've given us a reason to act." The hearing led to new legislation proposals, policies that would introduce limits to HOA authority, enforce transparency, and provide protections for elderly and low-income residents. It wouldn't change the past, but it could protect the future. Back home, the neighborhood threw a quiet celebration. Nothing loud or showy, just potluck dishes, folding chairs on front lawns, and laughter in the air. For the first time, people didn't just feel safe. They felt proud. Later that night, as the sun dipped below the trees, John sat with Lisa on the porch. "You know," she said, "most people would have walked away. Ignored the letters. Paid the fine. Moved on. I tried," he admitted. "But then they broke her statue." Lisa looked over at the garden. "She would have been proud." John nodded, a soft smile on his face. "She always told me, do what's right, even if you're the only one doing it." A breeze passed through the trees. The wind chimes on the porch swayed gently. John stood, stretched his back, and looked out at the street. A neighbor across the road waved. He waved back. No more board members watching through blinds. No more anonymous threats. Just people, real people, living side by side. Later that night, he wrote a letter. Not for the media, not for the commission, but for his late wife. He folded it neatly and placed it beside her statue the next morning. It read, "I kept my promise." And as he walked away, he didn't look back. He didn't have to. Because now, the neighborhood was watching out for each other, not out of fear, but out of hope. And that made all the difference. Months had passed since the investigation, and the neighborhood had transformed in ways John never thought possible. The lawns were no longer pristine because of fear, but because people took pride in their homes. Children played freely on sidewalks where no noise signs used to hang. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved, smiled, and even brought each other homemade pies. But for John, there was still something lingering beneath the peace. He stood at the edge of the community garden, watching a new family move into the house 3 doors down. The father lifted boxes while a mother held a baby on her hip. Their young daughter skipped beside them, clutching a small teddy bear. John walked over, extended a hand. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said with a warm smile. The man looked surprised. "Thanks. We weren't sure what to expect. The last neighborhood we lived in made it hard to even breathe." John chuckled softly. "You'll find it's different here. We had to learn the hard way." The man looked curious. "I heard something about that. You're the one who—" John nodded, gently. "Let's just say I stuck around when things got tough." That night, John sat by the fireplace, flipping through an old album. Pictures of his wife, the early days of their move here, the dreams they'd shared. He lingered on one photo, the two of them planting a tree together just before the HOA had tried to make him cut it down. That tree now stood tall and strong in his front yard, unmoved. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was Lisa. "You're going to want to see this," she said, her voice filled with excitement. A news article appeared on his screen. New law passed. HOA Accountability Act signed into law. It was official. The stories, the testimonies, the evidence, everything had led to real change. The new legislation required all HOAs to report financial activities, provided homeowners with appeal processes, and limited fines without due process. Best of all, it banned forced property sales over non-essential violations. John leaned back, letting the weight of it all settle. He thought of the people who had been pushed out, the neighbors who had suffered in silence, and the moments when he nearly gave up. And then he thought of his wife. The next morning, he hosted a small gathering at the garden. Neighbors brought flowers. Someone played soft music. Lisa read a statement from the commission thanking the neighborhood for being the spark behind the reform. And then John stood to speak. "I didn't ask for any of this," he began. "All I wanted was to live a quiet life. But when quiet turns into silence and silence becomes injustice, someone has to speak." He looked out at the faces, young, old, smiling, teary-eyed. "I didn't do this alone. You all stood with me. We rebuilt something stronger than fences or rules. We built trust." There was a long pause. He stepped back, letting the moment breathe. A young boy tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. John, my mom says you're a real-life hero." John kneeled beside him. "I'm just someone who didn't walk away." The crowd applauded softly. As the sun set, casting a golden light across the garden, John stood by his wife's statue once more. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, polished police badge, the one he had worn for over 3 decades. He placed it gently at the base of the statue, then whispered, "This belongs here now." He walked away without fanfare, without a final speech, because the work was done. And this time, peace wasn't something he had to fight for. It had finally found its place.